Nehmen Sie bitte Platz. Sehr geehrter Herr Bundespräsident, Frau
Mr. President,
Bundeskanzlerin,
Madam Chancellor,
Herr Bundesratspräsident,
Mr. President of the Bundesrat,
Kolleginnen und Kollegen,
Honourable
verehrte
members,
liebe Frau Deutschkron,
Ms. Deutschkron,
verehrte Gäste,
honoured
meine
guests,
Damen und Herren.
ladies and gentlemen.
Der 30. Januar ist nicht
The
irgendein
30th of
Datum.
January is not just any date.
Heute vor 80 Jahren,
80 years ago
am
today,
30. Januar
on the 30th of
1933,
January 1933,
wurde Adolf Hitler zum
Adolf
Reichskanzler
Hitler
ernannt.
was appointed Chancellor of the German Reich.
Damit begann das dunkelste Kapitel
Thus began the
der
darkest
deutschen
chapter in German history.
Die Nationalsozialisten
The Nazis
übernahmen an diesem
took
Tag die
power
Macht
in Germany on
Deutschland
that day and liquidated,
und liquidierten innerhalb weniger Wochen
within a
die
few weeks,
erste Demokratie
the first
auf
democracy
deutschem
on
Boden.
German soil.
Fast exakt 12 Jahre später,
Almost exactly 12
am
years later,
27. Januar
on the 27th of
1945,
January 1945,
befreite die Rote Armee das
the Red Army
Vernichtungslager Auschwitz,
liberated the Auschwitz
zum
extermination
Symbol
camp,
des Zivilisationsbruchs,
which has come to symbolize the breakdown of
menschenverachtender
civilization,
Brutalität
inhuman brutality,
und eines staatlich
and
organisierten
state-organized
Völkermords
genocide.
geworden. Beide Daten trennen nur
These 2
12
dates
Jahre
are separated by just 12 years
und eine Ewigkeit des Grauens.
and by an eternity of horror.
Am Ende des von Deutschland entfesselten Vernichtungskrieges
At the end of the war of extermination unleashed by Germany after the
lag
Nazis'
fast
fanatical
ganz
racism,
Europa in Trümmern.
almost all of Europe
Nicht
lay
nur
in
materiell.
ruins, and not only in the
Tiefer
material sense,
als die mit bloßem Auge sichtbaren Ruinen
much worse
europäischer
than
Städte
Europe's ruined cities, which were visible
reichten
for
die
all to see,
unermesslichen seelischen und geistigen Verwundungen.
was the incalculable emotional and mental
Wir
damage that had
gedenken
been
heute
inflicted.
aller Opfer der verbrecherischen
Today we
Ideologie
remember
des
all the victims of the
Nationalsozialismus.
Nazis' criminal
Aller
ideology,
Menschen, die um ihre materielle,
all the
seelische
people who
und
had their
physische
material
Existenz
possessions
gebracht
taken from them,
und
who were
ihrer
left
Würde beraubt
traumatized,
wurden.
who were robbed of their very lives and their
Verfolgten,
dignity, who were
gemarterten,
persecuted, tortured,
gedemütigten,
humiliated,
ermordeten.
and murdered.
Wir gedenken der europäischen Juden,
We remember the European
der Sinti
Jews,
und Roma,
Sinti, and Roma,
der zu Untermenschen degradierten slawischen
the
Völker,
Slavic people classified as
der
subhuman,
Zwangsarbeiterinnen und Zwangsarbeiter,
the forced labourers,
dem Hungertod preisgegebenen
prisoners of war
Kriegsgefangenen,
left to starve to death,
der Opfer staatlicher Euthanasie,
victims of state
der
euthanasia,
Homosexuellen,
homosexuals,
aller, die sich aus religiösen, politischen
and all those who, for
oder
religious
schlicht
or political
menschlichen
reasons,
Beweggründen
or
dem
out of
Terror
simple humanity,
widersetzten
opposed this terror
und deswegen der totalitären Staatsgewalt
and so
zum
fell
Opfer
victim
fielen.
to the totalitarian regime.
Wir gedenken Millionen und
We
Abermillionen
remember the
Tote.
countless millions of people who died.
Wir gedenken auch der Überlebenden,
We also remember the
derjenigen,
survivors,
die an dem Grauen der Unmenschlichkeit
those
seelisch
who were left
zerbrochen
broken by the horror of this
sind. Die, wie
inhumanity,
der Schriftsteller
who,
Jean
as the
Amery
author
einmal
Jean
sagte,
Amery once said,
nach der Shoah
were,
in
after the
dieser
Shoah,
Welt nicht mehr
no longer
heimisch
able to
werden
feel
konnten.
at home in the world.
Wir gedenken heute auch an alle, deren
Today,
Familien damals
we also think
ausgelöscht
of
wurden.
those whose families were murdered.
Ein Schicksal, das auch die Familie
This is the
von
fate
Inge Deutschkron
that
erlitt.
befell Inge Deutschkron's
Verehrte
family.
Frau Deutschkron, ich begrüße Sie.
Miss Deutschkron,
herzlich
I would like to
im
welcome you
Deutschen
very warmly to the German Bundestag.
Seit 1996
Since 1996,
begehen wir den Jahrestag der Befreiung des
our National Day of
Konzentrationslagers
Remembrance for the
Auschwitz
victims of National Socialism
als nationalen
commemorating the liberation
Gedenktag
of
für die
Auschwitz
Opfer des
has been
Nationalsozialismus.
held.
Wir
We
gedenken
commemorate
ihrer
the
im
liberation of the
Parlament,
Auschwitz concentration camp.
im wichtigsten Forum der
We
deutschen
remember the victims
Demokratie.
here in our parliament, the most
Der
important
Reichstag
forum
ist
of
ein
German
stummer
democracy.
Zeuge der Demontage
The Reichstag
unserer
building
ersten
is a
Demokratie.
silent witness
vor
to the
80
dismantling
Jahren.
of our first democracy 80 years
Deshalb ist
ago.
er der richtige Ort, um öffentlich
It is therefore the right
als
forum
Staat und Gesellschaft
for our state and society
den Toten Ehre zu erweisen
to honor the dead
und gleichzeitig den Willen zu bekunden,
and also
alles
to
zu
express
tun,
our determination
damit eine
to
ähnliche
do whatever it takes
menschengemachte
to
und
ensure
staatlich
that a
organisierte
man-made,
Katastrophe
state-organized
sich nie
catastrophe
mehr
of this
ereignen
kind
kann.
can never happen again.
Deshalb ist es gut, dass diese Veranstaltung von Phoenix
And that is why it is a
übertragen
good
wird.
thing that Phoenix is broadcasting this
Noch
event.
schöner wäre es, wenn auch ARD
But
und
it would be
ZDF
even better
wie
if the
wir
ARD and ZDF broadcasters would also find this ceremony important enough, as we do, to broadcast this ceremony, this joint ceremony of remembrance.
dieses gemeinsame jährliche Gedenken
This joint annual
und
ceremony
den
of
politischen Willen
remembrance,
aller
which
Demokraten
expresses the political will
einer
of
breiten
all
Öffentlichkeit im
Democrats,
Hauptprogramm
and to show this
öffentlich-rechtlicher
to the
Sendeanstalten
broad
zu können.
public at one of the main times, most important
Der
times
Weg
of
nach
day for
Auschwitz, meine Damen und Herren,
broadcasting.
begann mit der Zerstörung der Demokratie
Ladies and gentlemen, the
und der
road to
anschließenden
Auschwitz began with the destruction of
Pervertierung
democracy
legitimer Macht
and the subsequent criminal
in Willkür
persecution,
und
perversion,
Despotie.
of legitimate power to produce tyranny
wissen auch,
and despotism.
Die Machtübernahme durch die Nationalsozialisten
And we
war
also
kein
know
Betriebsunfall
that the Nazi
in
seizure
unserer
of power
Geschichte.
was not an accident of history.
Sie war weder zufällig
It was neither a
noch
chance event
zwangsläufig.
nor an inevitable one.
Die Selbstaufgabe der Weimarer Demokratie
The Weimar democracy's self-inflicted
bleibt
failure
eine Warnung und Verpflichtung
is a
für die
lasting
Nachgeborenen.
warning to those born in
Dieses
a later era.
Bewusstsein wach zu halten und zu vermitteln, hat Inge Deutschkron
And
zu ihrer
Inge
ganz
Deutschkron has
persönlichen
dedicated
Mission
herself to keeping alive this
Sie hat die
awareness and passing it on
nationalsozialistische
to others.
Diktatur als Unrecht zum geltenden
She
Recht
experienced and suffered
wurde
under
erlebt
the
und
Nazi
erlebt.
dictatorship when the system of
In
justice
Ihrem Buch
came to be
"Und ich
based
trug
on
den gelben
injustice.
Stern" beschreiben Sie, verehrte
In your
Frau
book,
Deutschkron,
Outcast,
die
a Jewish
Situation
girl
in
in
Berlin
wartime
in den 30er
Berlin,
Jahren
Ms.
und während des
Deutschkron,
Krieges.
you describe the situation in Berlin in the
Diskriminierung und
1930s
die
and during the
Schikanen
war,
gegen die Juden immer
how the
perfidere,
discrimination and harassment of
zynische
Jews
Formen angenommen
took
haben,
on ever more
wie die
perfidious and
Existenzängste
cynical
und schließlich die
forms,
blanke Todesangst,
how fears about
die
financial
täglichen Begleitern
survival
der
and
Entrechteten
later the
wurden.
naked fear of death became constant companions
Erinnerungen,
for those robbed of their
die
rights.
als Theaterstück
Inge
unter dem
Deutschkron's
Titel "Ab
memories
heute heißt du
have been
Sarah"
shown in the form of a
viele,
theatre
vor allem
play.
junge Menschen beeindruckt haben, sich
And this
ein
play had a
wertvolles
major impact on
aufklärerisches
many
Zeugnis.
people, particularly young people. Her memories form
Wir
a
leben in
valuable and
Deutschland heute in einer
informative
gefestigten,
testimony.
selbstbewussten Demokratie.
In Germany today, we live in a stable
wissen
and
auch,
self-confident democracy.
Diese Demokratie ist uns nicht ein für alle Mal
Yet this is
geschenkt,
not a gift which,
sondern muss
once
täglich
given,
gestaltet,
is
mit
everlasting.
Leben erfüllt
Every day it must be shaped,
und,
brought to
ja,
life
auch
in concrete
verteidigt
terms, and, yes, even defended.
Wie bitter nötig das auch heute ist, haben uns in jüngster
We've been
Zeit
reminded of just how necessary this is
unglaubliche,
recently
entsetzliche
by the inconceivable,
sogenannte
horrendous
NSU
series
Mordserie
of murders
und
carried out by the group
antisemitisch
calling
motivierte
itself the
Gewalttaten.
National Socialist Underground and by violent anti-Semitic attacks.
Alles, was das Böse braucht, um zu triumphieren,
All that is
ist
needed
das
for evil to
Schweigen
triumph
der Mehrheit.
is that good men do nothing.
hat der frühere
This was
UN-Generalsekretär
once said by
Kofi Annan
former UN Secretary General
einmal im
Kofi
Hinblick
Annan
auf die nationalsozialistische
when he was referring
Gewaltherrschaft
to
gesagt.
the Nazi dictatorship.
Das Wissen um die Vergangenheit
Thus,
ist daher
knowledge of the
auch
past
und gerade eine verbindliche
gives
Verpflichtung für
all
alle
Democrats
Demokraten,
a binding
ihre
duty
Stimme,
to speak out,
unsere Stimme,
to
gegen
raise their
jegliche
voices,
Ansätze
to
und
raise
Formen
our voices
von Ausgrenzung,
whenever faced with any kind of sign or form of marginalization, racism, or xenophobia, and even more importantly, to
Meine Damen und
act
Herren,
accordingly.
Erinnerung lebt vor allem von der
Ladies and gentlemen,
Unmittelbarkeit des Erlebten.
Remembrance essentially lives
Den
from the
Zeitzeugen
fact
der
that people,
damaligen
from the fact
Ereignisse
that people have experienced things
schwindet der
directly.
unmittelbare Zugang
As the number
zur
of contemporary
Vergangenheit.
witnesses who personally experience
Umso
the events of the
wichtiger
time dwindles,
sind neue
so the
Formen
direct
der
link to the past is weakened, so new forms of remembrance
Elie Wiesel,
take on increasing
Friedensnobelpreisträger,
importance. Elie Wiesel, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize and a survivor of the Holocaust, who was the guest speaker at the German Bundestag on the 27th of January 2000, once spoke about this task. He spoke about this task in terms of creating a new generation of witnesses, a generation of witnesses who listen to witnesses and thus become witnesses themselves. And this is precisely what happens at the annual youth encounter hosted by the German Bundestag. And I'm pleased that, once again, 80 young people from different countries have accepted the invitation to attend and would like to welcome the participants who, over the last few years, have been studying the issue of the Shoah in Ukraine in detail.
In Kiev,
they met people who had personally witnessed mass shootings and spoke to former forced laborers and prisoners of war. For many years, the Holocaust in the East, particularly in Ukraine and Belarus, was one of the most neglected chapters of the Second World War. In meticulously planned mass shootings, in Ukraine alone, 1.5 million Jews were murdered and buried in mass graves. Almost every village witnessed this tragedy. And it is particularly shocking to hear the consistent reports from witnesses who were children or young people at the time. They recall that the earth above the mass graves kept moving for days after the shootings. For some of the victims was still alive. And it is only in the last 10 years that hundreds of these mass graves were rescued from anonymity by the French priest Patrick Dubois, who I'd like to welcome most cordially here today. And just as the name Auschwitz has become synonymous with the industrial-scale murder carried out in the many Nazi death camps, the largest single act of murder during the Second World War in Babi Yar, near Kiev, has become a symbol of genocide by the bullet. On the 29th and 30th of September 1941, 33,771 Ukrainian Jews were shot in the ravine there. As recorded in several German reports written at the time. By November 1943, well over 100,000 people had been murdered in this ravine, including Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians. Germany is aware of the responsibility which it bears, and this responsibility is expressed, for example, in the new compensation agreement signed between the Federal Republic of Germany and the Jewish Claims Conference last November, after the Holocaust survivors from Eastern Europe had been forced to wait for so long for recognition in material terms of their persecution and suffering. Ladies and gentlemen, every year, the youth encounter demonstrates once again that there is considerable interest amongst young people in examining the past. And they have a great need to ask, what happened then, and why? How was it possible for these things to happen? Inge Deutschkron is one of the people who addresses these issues. She speaks from first-hand experience. She is one of around 1,700 Jews in Berlin who were rescued, who were able to escape deportation and certain death because they were helped by non-Jewish Berliners.
Die Erfahrung als verstoßene,
Inge Deutschkron has been shaped by her experiences as an outcast, the death sentence hanging over her, being hunted. These experiences have influenced her journalistic and literary work, as well as her tireless commitment to ensuring that the horrors are not forgotten. She has dedicated herself to keeping alive the memory of the Holocaust in Germany and making known the names of those helpers who demonstrated civil courage and rescued people subject to persecution. Ms. Deutschkron, yours is a great achievement. Just as Elie Wiesel described, you are passing on what you experienced to young people, presenting them with examples of silent heroes, to show them that, even in times of terror, it was possible to demonstrate humanity. You are helping to ensure the creation of a generation of witnesses who have listened to the witnesses. I would like to thank you for accepting this invitation to attend the ceremony of remembrance and to speak to us. Ladies and gentlemen, honoured members, this ceremony of remembrance began with the sound of synagogue music by Louis Lewandowski, who, in the 19th century, masterfully blended ancient Jewish tradition with the harmonies of the Occident to create something entirely new. His gravestone, located in the Row of Honor in Berlin's Weißensee Cemetery, bears the inscription, "Love makes the melody immortal." They tried to erase all memories of his music. Yet his music lives once again. I would like to thank the Synagogal Ensemble Berlin for keeping alive the tradition of Jewish music at religious services and concerts. We will now hear the traditional prayer, El Mala Rachanim, in which the names of specific concentration camps are named in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. Please stand for this.
היקרים, הקדושים והטהורים, שנשרפו ונחנקו ונהרגו על קידוש השם בידי הנאצים באושוויץ, בירקנאו, warschauer Ghetto, Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Mauthausen, Babi-Yar, Ravensbrück, Ghetto Riga, Ghetto Vilna, Buchenwald, Theresienstadt, Bergen-Belsen, Maidan, Treblinka, Bavur she'anu mitpalelim be'ad hazkarat nishmoteihem lachen, lachen, lachen amale arachamim yastirem beseter kinafave Yisrol hachaim et nishmotehem began Eden
Sie meine Rede? Meine Damen und Herren, der Titel meines Vortrags.
Ladies and gentlemen,
zerrissenes Leben.
The title of my speech is A Fragmented Life.
Dicht an dicht, so standen sie am Straßenrand.
Shoulder to shoulder,
In jener Nacht
they
des
lined the
1.
streets
Januar
that night
1933.
of the 30th of January 1933.
Jung und alte.
Men and women,
Und sie grüßten
young and
die
old,
Hunderte, die in ihren
and all of them
khakifarbenen Uniformen
there to welcome the
mit
procession.
dröhnendem Marschtritt
They
durch
watched
das
as
Brandenburger
hundreds
Tor
of
in die
khaki-clad,
Stadt
uniformed party loyalists marched through the Brandenburg Gate into the city of Berlin. Flaming torches held aloft, boots echoing ominously. The masses lining the streets flung up their arms in greeting and screamed with jubilation, thrilled at the seizure of power, the so-called Machtergreifung, the word coined by the new leaders of the German Reich to describe their electoral triumph, secured via a democratic process. Above the noise of the crowd, the serried ranks of marchers could be heard singing, "When Jewish blood spurts from our knives, then things go twice as well." It was just a song. Was it just a song? Or was it a symbolic expression of their politics? "Inge, my child, you are Jewish." My mother sat down beside me, as she always did, when she had something important to tell me. It was a few days after the Nazi Party seized power in Germany. "You belong to a minority now," she said, her voice steady. "You must show the other children in your class that you are just as good as they are." Of course, she said, she knew she could count on me for that. And then she added, her voice firm, "Don't take any nonsense from them. If anyone tries to hurt you, stand up for yourself." These words were to shape my life. But Jewish, what did it mean? I didn't ask. It was obviously a difficult topic. Perhaps it had to do with religion, a subject which wasn't taught at my school and was irrelevant at home. I can't remember whether my mother gave me a more detailed explanation. All I can remember is that I didn't understand. But there were some things I did know about: who the Nazis were, what their aims were, and who this man Hitler was. My mother had explained all that to me. She wanted me to understand the reasons for her numerous activities, all of which had to do with resisting the Nazis. It was why, more and more frequently, she had to leave me alone at home in the care of our housekeeper. "We are socialists," my mother once mentioned casually. "We're fighting for the victory of socialism in Germany, because that's the only way to guarantee equal rights for everyone and put an end to any further hostility towards the Jews." There were many nights when I couldn't sleep. I would listen out for footsteps echoing in the stairwell. The sound of jackboots filled me with fear. It could be men from the SA coming to arrest my father. Arrest. That was a word whose meaning I soon came to understand. People were often arrested. They were usually the ones who made no secret of their opposition to the new order. They were taken to the SA's torture chambers somewhere in Berlin and subjected to dreadful torments. That much I learned from the scraps of conversation I overheard while listening at the door of my father's study. He said, "The SA men made me crawl on all fours like a dog along a long corridor while they beat me with their whips." End of quote. I never told anyone how scared I was, and for the first time my mother wouldn't share her worries with me. I sensed very clearly that our lives had changed over the past few weeks. Life had become more serious. In the old days, our home had been filled with laughter, but now we were quiet and preoccupied. At least, that's how it seemed to me when the three of us sat round the table at lunchtime. I would ask questions or talk about what was happening at school. and my mother had always attached great importance to these conversations. But now, in stark contrast to before, her answers were terse. Although I had no idea what was going on, and my parents spared me the details, I was acutely aware of the tension now pervading our home. The atmosphere in the city had changed as well. The streets were noisier, the mood less friendly. Screeching loudspeakers informed the public about the unshakable authority of the new leaders and the great opportunity this afforded to the German people. Newspaper sellers shouted out the headlines to potential customers, so they fully appreciated the good fortune that history had bestowed upon them. Walls and advertising pillars were defaced and smeared with party slogans, impossible to ignore. Sometimes, on Sundays, crowds of Berliners would hurry to the public squares, keen to be the first in the queue at the field kitchens where some of Berlin's best-known actors, wielding enormous ladles, would serve up a hearty soup, all in the name of the party. On these occasions, a holiday mood prevailed, with a backdrop of drums, trumpets and flutes, all designed to strengthen the bonds between a jubilant nation and the Nazi party. Never before, and never again, have I seen my father as outraged as he was when he received a letter, postmarked the 7th of April 1933. It came from the Provincial Schools Board. It informed Dr. Martin Deutschkron, senior grammar school teacher, that the first law to be enacted by the new Reich government against its political opponents and Jews would now apply to him as well. This act ordered the dismissal of all civil servants whose political activities afford no assurance that they would at all times give their fullest support to the national state. My father wrote back, having served as a volunteer in the armed forces during the First World War, I have surely demonstrated my positive attitude to the national state. He was deeply affronted, as his words made clear. The ministry didn't deign to reply. The law was passed and implemented. For many civil servants and public service employees, it meant the loss of their jobs. For my family, too, it resulted in a drastic reduction in the household budget. My father rarely talked about his experiences during the First World War, even when he was asked about them directly. It was clear that he found it very difficult to share his recollections of horrors which, at the time, were unsurpassed in their brutality. He had memories of fighting at the Battle of Verdun in 1917. And he said, "My friend was shot before my very eyes. It's an image which will never leave me." My father was awarded the Iron Cross for his service in the First World War. He never wore it. He put it away in a drawer. It mysteriously vanished at some point or other in our fragmented life. Wear it with pride, the yellow star. These were the attempted words of encouragement from officials from the Jewish community of Berlin when, in September 1941, we were forced to attach this scrap of yellow fabric to our clothes. It had to be worn next to the heart on the outer garment and sewn on firmly. And this was a law that applied to all Jews over 6 years of age. With pride, when they saw that I was wearing the star, most Germans I encountered on the streets of Berlin averted their gaze or looked straight through me due to my outcast status, or they simply turned away. But like other Jews, I sometimes had happier experience as well. I remember that in the underground or on the street, usually in the dense crowds of the capital, strangers would move close to me and quietly slip something into my coat pocket. They never caught my eye, but would gaze innocently in the other direction. Sometimes it was an apple, sometimes it was a meat coupon, items that the Jews could not obtain officially, like so many of the things that would have improved our starvation rations. But there were others who looked at me with hatred or grimaced to show that they were disgusted by me, a Jewish girl. Wearing the star meant that we were certain to experience discrimination and isolation. On the street, I became accustomed to setting my face in a mask. I was determined that no one should have any inkling of how I was feeling inside. What did the yellow star mean to those who forced us to wear it? I wondered. Was it supposed to mark us out as targets? Was it intended to be a sign that we were heading towards a terrible end? I gave it a great deal of thought. I concluded that telling us in this way what dreadful fate was in store for us, that this made no sense whatsoever. It would simply terrify us and make us far less likely to follow orders obediently, as we had done until then. So when my mother came home and told me about the rumors that were circulating about what apparently lay ahead of us, I was distraught. I begged her to spare me the details. But what if the rumors are true? My mother replied. There was certainly no denying that the situation of the Jews in Berlin was becoming increasingly critical. The government issued new laws, new decrees, and new prohibitions for Jews almost every day, and we had to live by these rules. Anyone who was ordered to move into a so-called Judenhaus, for example, these were buildings designated as dwelling houses exclusively for Jews, had to share a room with at least one other person. To ensure that our isolation was complete, the telephone lines were cut and our radios were confiscated. We were not allowed to visit the hairdresser or wash our clothes at a laundry. We were not allowed to buy soap, eggs, or cake. The list of rations we were allowed to buy was short, and we could only purchase them between 4 and 5 in the afternoon. We were not allowed to attend any kind of cultural event. This was one of the first prohibitions to be introduced against Jews, and it also included taking a walk in a green space. We were even banned from keeping pets. They too fell victim to the racial laws that applied to their owners. The Reich Ministry of the Interior must have employed a whole army of heartless bureaucrats whose sole task was to dream up new ways of making our lives a misery. It was the 27th of February 1943, and the stillness of the early morning was broken by the roar of engines as police trucks raced through the streets of Berlin at an uncommonly early hour. A truck screeches to a halt, and a police officer jumps out, races into a house, and emerges a few minutes later with a man firmly in his grasp. He thrusts him into the truck and drives on. Soon they stop again, and the same scene occurs. The few passers-by, probably on their way to work, hasten their step. They know that something out of the ordinary is going on. See nothing, know nothing. That seems to be their motto, more or less. Lights go on in the nearby houses, and pale faces peer out from behind the kitchen curtains, the best vantage point to see what's going on in the street. They were rounding up the Jews. The last few remnants of Berlin's once proud Jewish community. The Nazi government was honoring its pledge to the German people to purge Berlin of its Jews. This final chapter in the persecution of the Jews of Berlin began in October 1941, when 1,000 Jews were sent forms by the Jewish community requiring them to list all their remaining possessions. The completed forms then had to be sent back to the Jewish community, which had no choice but to carry out the Gestapo's orders to the letter. On the 16th of October, 1941, the Gestapo themselves brought in these 1,000 people whose possessions they knew about from the forms. This took place after 8 p.m., of course, the hour at which all Jews were required by law to be at home. The Gestapo officers, in their grey leather coats, came for our roommate, Clara Sarah Hohenstein, a lady of around 65 years of age, a typical grandmother. 10 minutes later, she said her goodbyes, and she said, "The gentlemen themselves don't know where I'm going. I'll be in touch as soon as I can." And then she was taken away. After that, the deportations took place with some degree of regularity, with 1,000 or 1,500 people being sent from Berlin to the east every month. The number of people deported depended on the capacity of the German railway, the Reichsbahn. But now, the Gestapo left every aspect of the organization of these deportations to the Jewish community. Everything, that is, except for the task of sealing up the railway trucks, which were packed with people. That was a task that the German officers kept for themselves. The roundup of Berlin's last few Jews focused mainly on the factories which employed Jews as forced laborers, producing munitions for Hitler's wars. That day has gone down in the annals of Jewish persecution in Germany and is known as the Fabrikaktion, the factory action. But Jews were rounded up wherever they were, no matter what state they were in their apartments, on the street, in their dressing gowns, in their work clothes. With no idea of what lay ahead, they obeyed the instructions issued to them, just like all those who had been deported before them and whose fate was unknown. The only ones who remained behind were the few, including my mother and myself, who had found a hiding place and were living illegally. I watched from the window as well. I still replay the scenes in my head. The people, paralyzed with fear, the police herding them into the trucks, goading them to move faster. Schnell, schnell, schnell. This final deportation of Jews from Berlin took several days.
And then they were gone, all of them. My family, my friends, the blind Jewish dressmakers who worked for Otto Weidt, the Jewish soldiers from the First World War, their medals still visible on their lapels. We didn't hear anyone screaming, and we didn't see anyone resisting. We watched them being taken away, obediently, on their final journey. At night, they came back to me. I couldn't stop thinking about them. Where were they now? What was happening to them? I began to feel guilty. What right did I have to hide away and avoid a fate which should have been mine as well? This sense of guilt stayed with me, persecuted me, and it has never left me. A year after the war ended, my mother and I were granted permission to travel to England to see my father. Accompanied by other émigrés, my father met us at the station in London. I could tell immediately that for these émigrés, it was as if we were envoys sent by their murdered relatives. When they saw us, they found it hard to hold back their tears. We were the confirmation that their own families had lost the struggle to survive in Nazi Germany. And there it was again, this feeling of guilt. It was a feeling which sometimes gave way to speechlessness. When people in post-war Germany told me to forget about it, when they had no other way of forcing me to be silent. You have to be able to forgive, they said. It all happened so long ago. Most of the people I met in Germany's temporary capital, Bonn, had simply expunged these crimes from their memory. Crimes committed by the German state with its specially created machinery of murder, and which they themselves had allowed to happen. And then I realized quite suddenly that I had an obligation, born out of guilt. I had to write it down. I had to tell the truth, the whole truth, and describe what I had witnessed in precise and emotionless detail. For me, it was not that the guilty and those who had remained silent should try to find a way of making a gesture of atonement towards the Jewish people. No, that would have been meaningless. The German people, in those early years after the war, were protected from the truth by their first Chancellor, who stated in a government declaration to Parliament that most Germans had opposed the crimes against the Jews. He even claimed that many of them had helped the Jews to escape their murderers. Oh, if only this had been true. I became obsessed with the idea that nothing like this should ever happen again. No one should ever dispute someone else's right to life simply because of the color of their skin, their political beliefs, their religion, or anything else. It should never happen again, not here, not anywhere. And to achieve that goal, we have to know the truth, the whole truth. For until there are answers to the question of how these horrors could ever have happened in the first place, there is still a risk that similar crimes could be inflicted on humanity once again. I was determined to play my part in preventing that from happening, here and now, with all my energy and all my resolve. 7 years passed before my father and I were reunited. Shortly before the outbreak of the Second World War, my father had managed to flee to England. I had clear memories of him as quite a small man, but brisk in his movements, a popular teacher and political activist, full of energy and resolve. And during those 7 years, this image of my father was reinforced by my mother, who had similar recollections of her husband. And now here he was, sitting opposite me in Birmingham, at that time, a dreary and uninspiring town in the English Midlands. He looked tired, exhausted even, with a passive attitude to life, or so it seemed to me. During those 7 years, life in England had been a constant struggle, for no one ever considered why he had had to flee Nazi Germany. People were put off by his German name and his German accent. I, on the other hand, had had to fight to survive during those 7 years. For 2 years and 4 months, I was in hiding, helped by old friends of my parents who risked their lives for my mother and myself. And now that the war was over, I, like them, was determined to help build a Germany in which freedom and democracy prevailed. I proved this during the first year after the war in Berlin, when I was just 23 years old. When I was just 23 years old and the Soviets were attempting to extend their control to the whole of Berlin. I could see that my father was bemused. In 1939, he had left a teenager behind, and that was how he remembered me. Now, he was confronted with a vibrant young woman who had made fighting for freedom and the rule of law the guiding principle of her life. There was a glint in his eye when he suddenly admitted to me that he had talked the same language in the past. And finally, he revealed to me that after the war had ended, he had expected to be recalled to Berlin. After all, he had been thrown out in the truest sense of the word in 1933. For that reason, he said, he should be invited to return. He was, after all, a teacher of some repute. Yes, his 4 siblings and their families were amongst those who'd been murdered, but he still believed in the Germans who had once been his friends, and who, like my father himself, now felt that they had a duty to build a new Germany in which the rights of every individual were writ large. But this call from Berlin, this invitation, never arrived. As he said this, his gaze wandered away from me, as if he preferred not to show that he envied me my sense of purpose and my strength of will. So instead, he carried on teaching German in English schools. Every day, he would check his mailbox to see if there was a letter from Berlin. Instead, he received a letter from an English education authority, which suggested that he should apply for British citizenship if he wished to continue teaching in England. For days he thought about it, wrestling with the decision. Then he finally decided to take this step. The certificate arrived by post. My father took it in his hands and stood there for hours, holding the document that made him a British citizen. He stood gazing out of the window, staring into the distance, not letting anyone near. Can we imagine what was going through his mind? Thank you very much.
והוא אחד ואין שני, להבשילו להחבירו, בלי ולתוכלית, ולא עוד בעם ישרו.